Okay, so get ready, because today we're really digging into some serious food for thought. We're talking about G.K. Chesterton's Eugenics and Other Evils.
Right.
And you've shared some excerpts from it with us.
Yes.
Specifically chapters 1 through 9.
That's right.
Where Chesterton really goes after the eugenics movement of the early 1900s.
He did.
Now, this might seem like a thing of the past, but
Does a bit.
his arguments are still relevant, I think, today.
Shockingly so. Shockingly so.
Mm-hmm.
What's fascinating is, he doesn't just critique eugenics. He really goes after it. I mean, he compares it, uses words like poison. He talks about it like it needs to be destroyed.
Yeah.
Strong, strong language.
Talk about making a statement. It's like he's grabbing you by the shoulders saying, look, this is serious. And he doesn't waste any time getting right to the heart of it, because he's pointing out how easily something that sounds good, good intentions,
Oh, absolutely.
can go very, very wrong.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he says these good intentions pave the road to something far worse, far more insidious. He even makes this really bold comparison to pagan slave owners.
Wow.
And the control they exerted over their slaves. So, he really saw this ideology as this dangerous thing to the family,
Yeah,
society.
It's an attention getter. But you're right, the term eugenics can be kind of a slippery term.
It is.
It means different things to different people.
It does.
And to his credit, Chesterton acknowledges this.
He does.
And he says, he's not necessarily attacking people,
Right.
but he's attacking the ideology.
The idea, yeah. And this is where I think it gets really intriguing.
Okay.
Because he calls out the way that eugenics proponents will use this very vague, scientific-sounding language that almost sounds seductive, but it's really about control and coercion. He even coins this term. I love this. He calls them euphemists.
Euphemists.
Yes.
I love that.
It's great, isn't it? And he gives all these examples, really witty examples, of how they use language to kind of mask these really disturbing ideas.
Yeah, he was a master of satire. And he could really expose the absurdity of things.
He could.
But he doesn't just use, wit to make his point.
Right.
He brings in, real-world examples of what he sees.
Yes.
And he uses, as an example, the feeble-minded bill, which was being debated in England at the time.
At the time, right.
This wasn't some, dystopian fantasy. This was a real law that he was concerned about that could lead to people being institutionalized.
Absolutely.
For being feeble-minded, which who even knows?
Exactly.
What does that even mean?
It's such a vague term.
It's so vague.
And it's a chilling thought, too,
Yeah.
because, you think about, what if you had the power to deem someone as feeble-minded and have that be justification? Think about how many times we even use that phrase jokingly.
All the time.
Right. And it takes on a whole new meaning when you think about it in that context.
Wow, yeah. It makes you really realize how easily language can be twisted and manipulated.
It can.
To control and oppress.
Yeah.
Even under the guise of something like science, which should be neutral.
It should be. Right.
Right. Anyway, it's not just about individual laws or bills, though, right?
Right.
He sees something much bigger going on.
He does.
He uses this term, anarchy in authority.
Anarchy in authority.
Mm-hmm.
Which is very interesting because he says, I'm not so much worried about the rebellious mobs.
Right.
He says, I'm worried about a madness of government.
A madness of government.
Where the laws become so broad. The punishments become arbitrary. The definitions of what is a crime are almost meaningless.
Yeah.
And he says this is the breeding ground for something like eugenics to take root.
So the system itself is kind of coming unhinged.
Yes, yes.
And it's creating this opportunity or this potential.
That's right.
For an ideology like this to step in.
To step in with a solution. And it's the wrong solution, he would say. But they're offering a solution, that's right.
Yeah.
And he uses this great analogy of the witch hunts. How he says those who believe in witches start seeing them everywhere, right? Yeah. He says the same thing with eugenics. They start seeing defects everywhere.
Yeah.
Which can lead to this kind of, widespread persecution of anyone who doesn't fit this narrow definition.
Right.
Of fit.
A fit, which begs the question, who gets to decide?
Exactly.
Who gets to decide who's fit to reproduce? And this is where Chesterton really starts to, I think, systematically pick apart the eugenics argument.
He does.
Because he says, no one, no matter how smart they are, no matter how much, they know, can have the authority to make this decision.
It's true. And he uses these brilliant hypothetical conversations in the book.
No.
He says, imagine if you had a eugenics advocate sitting down with Lord Byron.
Oh, that's perfect.
Right.
Lord Byron.
The epitome of romantic individuality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Being judged.
Right.
Oh, that's brilliant. Okay.
What does that say about their criteria?
Exactly. Okay. I love that. So we've got this idea of like, well, how can you quantify somebody's worth?
Yes.
And then he doesn't stop there. He then goes on to tackle this idea that we hear all the time, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Right.
And he doesn't buy it.
Well, he sees right through it, especially when it comes to something as complex as society.
Right.
He says when you apply this logic of prevention to social engineering, it leads to this really frightening scenario where everyone is treated as potentially ill.
Right.
In need of constant monitoring and intervention.
It's like we're all just patients waiting to happen.
Yeah.
And we all need to be like, have a health advisor on speed dial 24/7.
Right. Exactly.
Even if we feel fine.
Right. And to illustrate this point even further, he tackles this direct challenge from a eugenics advocate named Dr. Saleeby.
Okay.
And Saleeby basically says to Chesterton, he says, you couldn't possibly produce a feeble-minded child, even if you tried, even if you came from a long line of feeble-minded ancestors.
Right. Which, Chesterton uses to point out the flaw in using statistics.
Yes.
To apply to something like feeble-mindedness, which you can't measure.
Right, exactly. It's like, trying to measure happiness with a ruler.
Right.
It's like as soon as you start trying to measure it, you change what it is.
Right, exactly.
That's a moving target.
It is. And he, of course, because he's such a wordsmith.
Oh, he's brilliant.
He comes up with this really, I think, telling analogy. He says, while I might believe in witches, I don't believe in witch smellers.
Yes, right.
Because
that's good.
Who gets to decide?
Right, exactly. And, speaking of witch hunts, this ties in with what he talks about when he talks about the established church of doubt.
Okay, yes.
This idea that, used to be, that religion was,
right.
Kind of the thing.
Right.
But he's saying now it's science.
It's science.
It's being enforced by the government.
Right. And okay, so I got to be honest, because this is the part where I was like, wait a minute, is he saying science is bad?
Right. And he's not saying it's bad.
He's not saying science is bad. He's saying blind faith in anything.
Yes.
Can be dangerous.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Especially if it's being used to control people's lives.
Exactly.
And he gives the example of mandatory vaccination.
Right. Which hello. Still relevant today.
So relevant. It seems like every other day it's in the news.
Absolutely.
It's this huge debate, and he saw it then.
He did.
He saw this tension.
He saw where it was going, yeah.
So anyway, he says eugenics, with all of its, emphasis on experimentation.
Right.
And how their theories were always changing.
Yes, right.
And it isn't really science. It's like this, what do you call it? This church of doubt.
The church of doubt.
Yeah.
It's like they're searching for validation.
Yep.
They haven't quite found the truth yet. But in the meantime, we're going to experiment on all of you.
It's like they've decided that they get to be the arbiters of truth. But the truth...
It's changing.
It keeps changing. Yeah, exactly. And in the meantime, it's real people.
Real people.
That are being impacted.
Absolutely. And so, I think what Chesterton really wants us to look at is the motivations.
Okay.
Like, what is really driving this kind of thinking?
Yeah.
And he says, as much as they claim that it's about improving humanity, it's really about maintaining this power structure.
So it's about control then?
It's about control. And to kind of illustrate this, he uses this really interesting character in the book. He calls him the man with a history.
Okay.
And it's basically this fictional capitalist who starts out as like a liberal.
Okay.
But then he becomes disillusioned by all the social problems he sees around him. The poverty and the crime.
The inequality,
right?
Yeah.
And I think we see this today.
We see this all the time.
All the time. People who start out
and
they're like, wait a minute, the system's not working.
Yeah.
Right. But instead of saying, well, let's address those root causes.
Right.
Let's look at inequality, lack of opportunity.
Exactly.
They arrive at a very different solution, which is control the poor. Let's control their reproduction.
Wow. So instead of fixing the system, we're going to fix the people.
Yes, exactly. And he calls this the wrong kind of socialism.
The wrong kind of socialism.
Because they're not really interested in uplifting the poor. They're really interested in just maintaining their own position.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right, exactly.
You can't help but see the through lines in history.
There are so many.
So many movements that started out with good intentions.
Absolutely.
And then those in power are like, this is great. We can use this.
Yes. We can co-opt this. That's right. And Chesterton really believed this was at the heart of the eugenics movement.
Right.
It was about, creating this more efficient, more compliant workforce.
Right, right.
That would just benefit the powers that be.
Right. For the people at the top. So it's not really about weeding out illness.
It's about weeding out anything that threatens the system.
That threatens the established order of things.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And he saw this even in his own time, this obsession with efficiency as dehumanizing. He points to examples like the vagrancy laws.
Okay.
The vagrancy laws, which basically made it illegal to be poor.
Wait, you could get arrested for being poor?
You could get arrested for being poor.
That's awful.
It was basically a way to funnel the poor into workhouses.
Oh, okay.
And force them to take whatever labor was offered, no matter how terrible the conditions were.
Right.
And by taking away their options, they basically created this captive workforce.
So how does this connect to eugenics, though?
Because it's the same mindset, you see.
Okay.
It's this idea, control the poor, dictate their choices, and ultimately dictate their very existence.
Okay.
He even criticizes, it's interesting, he criticizes the game laws of his day, which prohibited, like, hunting and fishing.
Wait, you'd think that would be a good thing.
You'd think so, right?
Like, feed yourself, yeah.
Right, exactly. But he said, no, this is about controlling access to resources.
Oh, I see.
So by making it illegal for the poor to hunt and fish,
Right.
you make them more reliant on the wealthy for their very survival.
Okay, yeah.
And this creates, more desperation. And they saw this as a way to, again,
To control
them, to create this more compliant workforce.
Yeah. It's starting to sound really familiar, this idea that, we see it today where certain groups are, they're kept down, their options are limited.
Right.
And it's all to benefit those who are already in power. And so Chesterton really believed that this was at the very heart
Yes.
of the eugenics movement.
Right. This was not just about, eliminating, undesirable traits.
Right.
It was about eliminating undesirable thoughts.
Right.
Undesirable beliefs.
So it's not just controlling, who reproduces, but
Right.
what they think.
Exactly.
That's
And what their children will think.
out of,
It is.
a
This
dystopian novel.
Yeah.
That's scary.
It is scary stuff. And he recognized this.
Yeah.
Because if you can control who gets to have children, who gets to pass on their genes, then you're essentially controlling
The future.
the future of humanity.
Wow.
Right.
And what happens to freedom of thought?
Exactly.
Individuality?
Where does that go?
What happens to all that?
Right. And this, haunted him. This idea that for all of its scientific pretense,
Right.
that eugenics was ultimately this profound threat
Yeah.
to human freedom. He saw it as the ultimate expression of a worldview that values efficiency and conformity over individuality and compassion.
So it's like we're creating this world where progress can't happen
That's right.
because we've eliminated all the different thinking.
Exactly. We've stifled what makes us humans.
So where do we go from here? If eugenics is so dangerous, this is a wolf in sheep's clothing, how do we even make sure this doesn't sneak back into our thinking?
Right.
In other ways.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Chesterton does offer us some guidance here. And he says that true freedom, it doesn't come from just this constant change or this relentless progress, but it comes from having a place to stand, having a sense of belonging, a connection to something bigger than ourselves.
It's so interesting you say that because it seems like everywhere we turn,
Right.
It's like embrace change, disrupt, optimize. We've come to believe that change equals progress.
Right.
Even if that change leaves us feeling kind of empty, adrift.
It's a very seductive narrative.
Yeah.
This idea that new is always better and that tradition is something to be, discarded rather than,
Right, than something valuable.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And Chesterton's challenging us to rethink that, I think.
Yeah.
That tradition, family, community, these are not just relics of the past.
Right.
They're the foundations.
Right, of a good life.
Yes.
Of a meaningful life.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. He's not saying, we should just blindly adhere to every tradition.
Right, right.
Just
stay stuck.
Just stay stuck in the mud. But he's saying that tradition, it evolves, it adapts.
Mm-hmm.
But it gives us this sense of continuity, the shared history that connects us to those who came before us and those who will come after us. It gives us a framework for understanding the world.
So how do we take all of this
Right.
and apply it to today?
Right.
How do we hold these two things, this idea of progress,
Yes.
but also this need to be rooted in something?
And I think what Chesterton would say is that true progress, It can't just be about material advancement
Right.
or technological innovation. It has to be about moral and spiritual growth as well.
Right.
It has to be about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
To contribute.
To thrive.
To thrive. Yes, exactly. Thank you. It's more than just surviving, you know?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, where his critique of eugenics comes full circle. Because he challenges us to ask, what does it mean to be fit in a society?
Right.
Is it just about, fitting some arbitrary standard of efficiency, or is it about something much more, deep and profound, something that can't be measured on a test? You know?
It's a question that I think goes way beyond this whole debate.
It really does.
About eugenics. It gets at the heart of what does it mean to be human?
Yes, and I think his answer is it's challenging, but it's also really hopeful. Because he's reminding us that our true fitness is not about our genes or our, test scores. It's about our capacity for love, for compassion, for creativity. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity of every single person, regardless of their fitness or their usefulness to society.
We all have value.
We all have value.
It's about building a world where everybody has that opportunity.
Yes.
To live up to their full potential.
Yes. And not to some predetermined standard, but to their own unique, their own unique gifts and talents.
Yeah.
That's what makes us special, right?
It is. Chesterton wants us to, celebrate our differences. See them as, like you were saying, a strength.
Absolutely.
Not a negative.
And he wants us to, build that society that values compassion over competition.
Right.
Where we're all striving to be the best versions of ourselves.
Yeah. That's quite a vision.
It is.
It really is.
It's a good one, though.
It is a good one. It's one worth striving for. It really is a good reminder that progress isn't about getting rid of all our differences.
That's right.
It's about figuring out how to live well together.
It is.
Yeah. Well, this has been quite the journey. I mean, this deep dive into eugenics and other evils. It's amazing to me how a book that was written over a century ago
I know.
Can still feel so relevant.
Right. It's amazing. And I think it speaks to his insight.
It does.
And this, this enduring belief.
Yeah.
In the power of human goodness.
Humanity. Yeah. Yeah.
And that we shouldn't give up, even in the face of these big challenges, that we just can't lose sight of that.
Yeah. It's inspiring. And I think on that note, Chesterton reminds us that progress requires us to be vigilant.
He does.
To always be questioning.
Yes.
So the next time you hear somebody talking about progress, ask yourself, progress towards what?
That's right.
And at what cost?
At what cost? Yes. That's it. Yeah. That's what he would want us to be asking.
Well, thank you for this.
Thank you. This was fun.
This was a great conversation.
I always love talking about Chesterton.